The sound of her own breathing was the only thing she could hear beneath the heavy weight of her helmet, sharp and steady, each inhale a reminder of the mission she had sworn she would not fail. They had told her from the start that it was impossible, that no one had ever managed to infiltrate a target so well guarded, that the attempt alone would be madness. Those words had echoed in her mind for weeks, spoken by commanders, teammates, even those who once believed in her skill, all insisting she was walking toward failure. But as she pressed her body flat against the wet concrete, the night sky draped over the city like a dark cloak, she refused to let their doubts define her. Her heart pulsed with defiance, each beat fueling the quiet fire that told her she was ready, that her years of training, pain and sacrifice had prepared her for this very moment. The target was ahead, hidden inside layers of security, but she had studied every inch, memorized every shadow, and tonight she would show them all that the word impossible was nothing more than fear disguised as logic. Her path had not been simple. Months earlier, when the mission was first assigned, she had been told in a curt briefing that the man she was after was untouchable. He was shielded by mercenaries with no conscience, satellites that scanned for even the smallest irregularity, and a fortress of technology designed to break the strongest infiltrators. Every simulation they had run ended in failure. Drones detected her heat signature. Guards intercepted her within minutes. At first her peers had chuckled, calling it a suicide run. Then the laughter faded into silence as they realized she wasn't joking, that she intended to attempt it anyway. Her superiors tried to strip her of the mission, warning her that failure would cost not only her life but compromise everything they stood for. But she had stared them down, her voice calm but firm, saying only one thing: "Then I will not fail." Something in her tone silenced the room that day. They thought her arrogance dangerous. She thought their doubt insulting. From that moment she had trained harder than ever before, cutting herself off from distraction, diving into a rhythm of brutal preparation that left her bones aching and her body screaming. Every weakness she possessed she confronted and tore apart. Every mistake she turned into discipline. By the time she was done, she had become sharper, colder, yet burning with an intensity none of them could measure. The city itself was against her tonight. Rain fell in sheets, slicking the rooftops, turning every surface into a hazard. Lightning split the sky in ragged lines, each flash threatening to reveal her to wandering eyes. Yet she moved like liquid shadow, her boots silent on the steel girders, her figure melting into the storm. She carried only what she needed: a suppressed rifle strapped across her back, a knife at her thigh, and the small, precious device designed to break into the target's secure channel. She did not intend to fire unless absolutely necessary. Silence was her ally, the storm her shield. Below her, lights flickered through office towers and streets still alive with the hum of midnight traffic. Somewhere beneath that chaos lay the man she was hunting, a figure who had haunted her thoughts for months. He was no ordinary target. He had orchestrated massacres, spilled innocent blood across borders, and walked free because no law dared to reach him. For her, this was not just a mission, it was retribution. And though she had been told it was impossible, tonight would prove otherwise. She reached the edge of a building overlooking the compound. From here, she could see the outlines of guard patrols, their movements timed to a rhythm she knew better than her own heartbeat. She had studied these men through countless nights, memorized when they turned their heads, when they paused to smoke, when they hesitated at blind spots. One mistake on their part, one hesitation, and she would slip past. Her pulse steadied as she crouched, counting down silently, letting the rain drip from her helmet as her eyes tracked the sequence. When the moment came, she moved. Her body slid over the ledge, catching the cable she had secured hours before, her descent quick and controlled. She landed behind a rusted storage unit, water pooling around her boots, and exhaled slowly, grounding herself. She could hear voices now, guards speaking in hushed tones, laughing about something meaningless, unaware of the storm about to break their world apart. She stayed low, crawling along the shadows, her body close to the ground, each movement rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. To them she was invisible. To herself she was inevitable. The first challenge came sooner than she had hoped. A drone buzzed overhead, its sensors sweeping across the courtyard in thin, almost invisible lines. One step into the open and it would have tagged her, sending alarms screaming into the night. She froze, pressing her back against the cold wall, heart hammering as the red eye of the machine drifted closer. Timing was everything now. She waited, every muscle screaming for release, until the drone shifted just far enough, its lens angling toward the opposite corner. In that heartbeat, she rolled forward, tucking herself into the shadow of a crate, Her breath caught in her throat until the machine drifted past. Relief flooded her chest, but she smothered it instantly. There would be no space for triumph yet. Not until he was down. Inside the compound walls, the world felt different. The air was thicker, weighted with the scent of oil, sweat, and metal. She could hear the faint hum of generators, the murmur of radios, the constant shuffle of boots against the floor. It was a hive, restless and alive, and she was the ghost moving through its veins. Her mind replayed every detail she had learned. The hidden corridors, the blind stairwells, the moments of silence between shift changes. Her hand brushed the knife at her thigh, not out of fear but reassurance. She knew she might need it soon. As she crept through the first hallway, her reflection flashed in a rain-smeared window. A soldier transformed, eyes burning, jaw set, no longer the woman they told it was impossible for. She had become something they could not measure. Something dangerous. She remembered her mentor's words as she moved deeper into the compound. Courage is not the absence of fear. It is the refusal to let fear decide. Those words had carried her through sleepless nights, through the endless drills that had nearly broken her. Now, in this place where every sound could betray her, they anchored her. She was afraid, only a fool would not be, but her fear was sharpened into focus, driving her forward rather than holding her back. Each corner she cleared, each door she pressed open, was proof of her resolve. Somewhere ahead, the man sat surrounded by his guards, confident in the fortress he had built, laughing perhaps at the idea that anyone would dare to reach him. She almost pitied him. He did not know yet that the storm outside was not his greatest enemy. She was. Step by step, she drew closer, her body soaked, her breath steady, her will unshaken. Every second stretched long, the silence deafening, the tension so thick it pressed into her chest. Yet beneath it all was clarity. She had been told it was impossible. She had been warned she would fail. But as she tightened her grip on the knife, as the echo of boots neared just around the bend, she knew with certainty that the impossible was already cracking. The night would prove it. The guard's footsteps grew louder, boots slapping against the wet concrete floor as he turned the corner into the dim corridor. She melted into the shadows, her back pressed tight against the wall, every muscle locked still. The faint glow of his flashlight swept across the hall, a wavering beam that lingered dangerously close to her position. She slowed her breathing until it was nearly silent, the rhythmic rise and fall of her chest controlled through sheer discipline. The man muttered something under his breath in a language she did not recognize, scratching at his chin as he walked closer, his rifle loose in his hands. For a moment, it seemed as though he would pass her by, his eyes scanning but never truly seeing. But then he paused, his head tilting as though sensing something amiss, the beam of his light sliding along the wall just inches above her. Instinct took over. In a single motion, she surged forward, her gloved hand clamping around his mouth as the knife in her other hand slid cleanly across his throat. The man struggled, a muffled cry caught beneath her palm, then his body went limp, the weight collapsing into her arms. She lowered him silently to the ground, eyes narrowing as she wiped the blade against his uniform before slipping it back into its sheath. One less obstacle. No alarms. The mission remained intact. Her heart still beat quickly, though she forced herself into calm again. There was no time to linger, no space to let the image of his lifeless eyes distract her. She had made peace with these choices long ago. The target she hunted was a monster, and those who guarded him had chosen their side. She moved past the body, stepping lightly to avoid the blood pooling across the floor, and pressed deeper into the compound. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with steel doors and faint buzzing lights overhead, each one flickering in protest against the storm that raged outside. She traced the route in her head, following the map she had memorized until every twist and turn was second nature. Down this hall, 2 flights of stairs, then through the service tunnels that ran beneath the barracks. That path would lead her closer to the command center where the man was said to reside. The challenge was surviving long enough to reach him. Descending the first staircase, she crouched low, her ears straining for the sound of voices. Thunder rumbled overhead, rattling the structure, masking the creak of her boots against the steps. She kept her rifle close now, the barrel angled downward, finger resting near the trigger but not yet pressing. The knife was a silent tool, but silence could not always be guaranteed. If gunfire broke out, she knew the compound would erupt into chaos. It was a risk she would take only if cornered. At the bottom of the steps, a door waited, half open, its hinges groaning against the wind that funneled through the tunnels. She slipped inside, pausing to let her eyes adjust to the near-total darkness. The air here was damp and stale, carrying the smell of mildew and rust. Pipes lined the walls, dripping occasionally into shallow puddles that dotted the floor. The tunnels were narrow, suffocating almost, and the sound of her movements echoed faintly despite her caution. She hated this part. There was nowhere to hide if she were discovered. Still, she pushed forward, reminding herself that every step brought her closer to the target. Halfway through the tunnel, she heard voices ahead, deep and resonant, carrying through the cavernous space. 2 guards stationed near the junction where the tunnels split. She crouched, edging toward the corner until their outlines came into view. They stood casually, rifles slung over their shoulders, speaking idly as though bored of their shift. She studied them in silence, weighing her options. She could try to bypass them, slipping into the shadows and praying the storm's noise covered her presence. Or she could remove them quickly, 2 more lives sacrificed to reach the one who had taken so many. The decision carved itself swiftly in her mind. She could not risk them spotting her later. The element of surprise was her most valuable weapon. She slid her rifle from her back, bracing it against her shoulder as she exhaled to steady her aim. 2 sharp bursts of suppressed fire cracked through the tunnel, muffled but lethal, each bullet striking its mark. Both men collapsed before they could react, their voices silenced mid-sentence, their rifles clattering uselessly to the ground. She advanced, checking their pulses out of reflex though she knew the outcome, then dragged their bodies into the darkest recess she could find, covering them beneath debris. The tunnel grew silent again and she pressed forward. The command center loomed just beyond these tunnels, a reinforced chamber lined with thick steel and guarded by more men than she had seen thus far. Reaching it would be the true test. She paused at the final bend, her back against the wall as she peered out. Floodlights glared across the courtyard, slicing through the rain as guards paced along raised platforms. She counted 6 immediately visible, though she knew there were more hidden in the shadows, waiting. Beyond them stood the structure itself, a towering block of reinforced concrete with narrow slits for windows and only one heavily guarded entrance. She clenched her jaw, her mind racing through possibilities. To storm the front would be suicide. She needed another way. Then she remembered the blueprints she had studied, the forgotten details tucked into the margins of classified files. A ventilation shaft, narrow but passable, led from the rear of the courtyard directly into the command center. It was risky, crawling through such a confined space could leave her trapped, but it was the only chance she had of reaching him unseen. The problem was the guards. They lingered near the back of the courtyard too, rotating in a tight pattern that left almost no opening. Almost. She watched them carefully, tracking the rhythm of their movements until she saw it. A 3-second window where their paths diverged just enough. 3 seconds to cross open ground, 3 seconds to reach the base of the wall, 3 seconds to disappear. Her breath slowed as she prepared, her body coiling like a spring. Then the moment came. She sprinted, boots splashing through puddles, her figure darting low across the yard. The rain shielded her, the thunder swallowed her sound, and before the guards could glance her way, she was pressed against the wall, hidden in shadow. Relief surged through her veins, but again she forced it down. There was no victory yet. She searched quickly, her hands brushing the wall until she found the vent, rusted and nearly forgotten. With a careful twist of her knife, she loosened the screws, prying the cover free before slipping inside. The shaft was suffocating, every movement scraping against metal, the sound magnified in the narrow corridor. She inched forward on her elbows, her breath hot against the steel, the confined darkness pressing against her senses. Sweat slicked her brow despite the cold, but she refused to stop. Every inch dragged her closer to the chamber, closer to the man who thought himself untouchable. She imagined him sitting there now, surrounded by screens and guards, plotting his next act of cruelty. The thought hardened her resolve. For every innocent life he had stolen, for every time they had called this mission impossible, she would prove them wrong with his silence. The shaft opened gradually, a faint light spilling through a thin grate ahead. She crawled closer, peering through the slits until she saw the room below. There he was, seated at a long table, flanked by armed men, his face calm, confident, unbothered by the storm outside. Her pulse quickened. After months of preparation, after endless training and sacrifice, she was here. The impossible was within reach. She stayed still for several minutes, her body pressed tight against the narrow metal walls of the ventilation shaft, her eyes locked on the scene unfolding below. The target leaned back in his chair, his posture exuding the arrogance of a man who believed himself invincible. His hair was slicked back, his face scarred from old battles but softened by the smug confidence of someone surrounded by power. The guards at his side were heavily armed, their rifles angled casually but their eyes sharp, scanning the room with habitual alertness. Every few seconds one of them shifted his stance, boots scraping against the tiled floor, a small sound that echoed through the chamber. She noted each detail carefully, their weapons, their angles, the distance between them and the man she had come to silence. She could see it all clearly, the very thing her commanders had called unreachable. He was right there, less than 10 feet beneath her. And yet, those 10 feet were lined with danger, every second threatening to unravel months of preparation. Her pulse hammered in her ears, but her breathing remained steady. This was the moment she had imagined 1,000 times. Now she had to make it real. The grate in front of her was old, its screws rusted and fragile. She reached into her vest, fingers closing around a small vial of oil she had carried for this purpose. With slow, practiced motions she applied it to the edges, dulling the sound of metal on metal. Every second felt like an eternity as she twisted the screws free, her movements painfully cautious, her ears straining for any sign that the guards below had noticed. A creak echoed faintly and she froze, her heart skipping a beat as one of the guards shifted, looking briefly toward the ceiling. But the storm outside rattled the windows just then, thunder crashing loudly, masking the faint noise she had made. The guard dismissed it, returning his attention to the doorway. She exhaled silently, relief flowing through her, and with one final twist, the grate came loose. She caught it in her hand before it could fall, tucking it aside inside the shaft. Now there was only the drop between her and the impossible. She adjusted her grip on the rifle strapped to her back, though she did not intend to fire it yet. Noise was still the enemy, and a bullet, even suppressed, could risk everything. The knife was her ally, silent and unforgiving. She wrapped her fingers around the hilt, her knuckles tightening as she positioned herself over the opening. Below, the guards stood with casual readiness, their bodies between her and her target. She could not take them all at once. She needed precision, patience, timing sharper than any blade. She waited, her muscles trembling slightly with the strain of holding herself poised above the opening, until the moment came. One of the guards moved to the far end of the table, distracted by the crackling sound of a radio. The other shifted his weight, his rifle angled downward as he reached to adjust his earpiece. The target leaned forward, speaking in a low voice, his attention entirely consumed by the conversation at hand. That was her chance. She dropped silently, her boots hitting the floor with a muffled thud as she landed behind the closest guard. Before he could react, her knife swept across his throat, a clean and silent strike that left him crumpling without a sound. She caught his body, lowering it to the ground even as her eyes snapped toward the second guard. His eyes widened as he turned, rifle jerking upward, but she was already in motion. She surged forward, slamming into him with her shoulder, the knife plunging into his chest as they stumbled back against the wall. His breath escaped in a wet gasp, his rifle clattering from his hands. She twisted the blade free and let him fall, her chest heaving but her movements precise, efficient, unstoppable. In the span of seconds, two men who had sworn to guard the untouchable lay lifeless at her feet. And then her eyes locked on him. The target had risen from his chair, his hand going instinctively to the pistol at his belt. Their eyes met across the room, hers burning with cold fire, his wide with shock that someone had dared to breach his fortress. For a moment, time froze. She could see the disbelief in his expression, the dawning realization that everything he had been told about his safety was a lie. She moved first. Her knife gleamed in the dim light as she charged, closing the distance between them before he could steady his aim. The pistol roared once, the shot deafened by the suppressors woven into the walls, but the bullet tore past her shoulder harmlessly. She slammed into him, her hand wrenching the pistol away as they crashed against the table. Papers scattered, a glass shattered, and his breath came in ragged snarls as he fought against her grip. He was strong, far stronger than she had anticipated, his muscles honed by years of survival in the brutal world he ruled. But strength was not enough. She had trained for this moment, sculpted herself into a weapon sharper than any blade. She pressed the knife against his throat, her voice a low hiss that cut through the chaos. "This ends tonight." He struggled, eyes flashing with rage, his voice breaking into guttural curses. "You think you can kill me? Do you know who I am?" His words dripped with arrogance, even now, even with death pressing cold against his skin. She said nothing, her silence more powerful than any reply. She thought of the faces of the innocent who had fallen because of him, the lives erased by his cruelty, the countless times justice had been denied. She thought of every person who had told her this was impossible, who had dismissed her resolve, who had laughed at her determination. And she pressed harder, the blade slicing just enough to draw a thin line of blood. His eyes widened as he realized she was not bluffing. Fear, real and raw, replaced his arrogance. For the first time in years he understood vulnerability. But then the sound of boots thundered in the hallway outside, shouts echoing as guards rushed toward the chamber. Her window was closing. She had seconds to finish what she came for before the room filled with reinforcements. Her grip tightened, her body coiled like a predator ready to strike. The target twisted violently, knocking them both sideways, the knife slipping slightly in her hand. He roared, slamming his elbow into her ribs, the impact jolting pain through her body. She staggered but did not falter. They collided again, the pistol sliding across the floor as both scrambled for control. He lunged for the weapon but she was faster. She kicked it away, the gun spinning into the shadows. His fists rained down in desperation, but she ducked beneath them, driving her shoulder into his chest and forcing him back against the wall. The knife pressed once more against his throat, deeper this time, his breath ragged and panicked. The shouting outside grew louder, the door rattling as guards prepared to storm inside. Her heart pounded. This was the moment, the line between success and failure, between proving them all wrong and becoming another forgotten casualty. She bared her teeth in determination, her eyes locked on his, and whispered, "Impossible," they said. And then the door burst open. The door exploded inward with a crash of metal against the wall, the storm outside echoing its fury as half a dozen guards surged into the room. Their rifles were raised, their eyes widening at the sight before them. Two of their comrades dead on the floor, their commander pinned against the wall with a knife pressed to his throat, and the intruder who should never have made it this far standing in defiance of everything they believed secure. For a fraction of a second, shock paralyzed them, and in that sliver of time she acted. She yanked the target forward, pulling him into the open, his body a shield between her and the line of rifles. Bullets were death waiting to be unleashed, but none of them dared fire while their leader's life hung in the balance. His muffled growl of rage echoed against her shoulder as she tightened her grip around his throat, the edge of her blade biting into his skin. The room seemed to freeze in chaos, lightning flashing through the narrow windows, illuminating the scene in fractured bursts of white. She could feel their hesitation, their fear of pulling the trigger. For the first time tonight, silence was louder than any gunfire. The commander thrashed in her grasp, shouting at his men to kill her, to take her down no matter the cost. But his words rang hollow when each of them hesitated, their rifles twitching but never steadying, eyes flicking nervously between their leader and the blade against his flesh. She dragged him backward step by step, her own breathing controlled but her body alive with adrenaline. She had not planned for this exact moment, but her instincts were sharper than any plan could be. If she was to escape this fortress alive, she needed leverage, and now she had it. "Drop them," she hissed, her voice a low growl that carried through the storm's echoes. "Now." The guards exchanged uncertain glances, their fingers twitching against triggers, but none of them moved. She pressed the blade harder, a thin line of blood spilling from the man's neck, his snarl breaking into a strangled gasp. "Do it," she demanded again, and at last one rifle clattered to the ground, then another, the metallic thuds ringing like small victories. Not all obeyed, but the hesitation had given her the wedge she needed. Her mind raced, searching for an exit. The door behind them was blocked, more men pouring in with every passing second. To her left, a narrow stairwell led upward, its shadows swallowing the flicker of the floodlights. That was her path, the only chance to vanish before the compound descended into total lockdown. She shoved the commander forward, forcing him to stumble toward the stairwell as she guided him like a shield, her blade never leaving his throat. The guards shouted after them, some following but unable to risk firing. Her boots pounded against the steps, the metal ringing beneath her weight as she dragged him higher and higher, the stairwell twisting into darkness. His resistance grew more frantic with each step, his fists striking backward, his feet kicking, but she was relentless. Every strike he landed was returned with cold steel pressed deeper against his skin. He could fight her, but every moment of defiance only reminded him of the death waiting inches away. The storm outside howled louder as they reached the upper levels, wind tearing through shattered windows, rain soaking the floor until it gleamed like glass. At the top of the stairs, she found herself in a control room overlooking the courtyard below. Screens lined the walls, their glow illuminating the chaos as alarms began to wail across the compound. Red lights pulsed, casting the world in a sinister hue, and the storm beyond the glass seemed to merge with the fury inside. Guards were shouting through radios, their voices sharp with panic as orders clashed and confusion spread. She pulled the commander into the room, slamming the door shut behind her, her back pressed against it as she took in the layout. A single reinforced window dominated the far wall, rain streaking down its surface, the city lights beyond flickering faintly through the storm. The room vibrated with the storm's wrath, and in that chaos she saw her chance. An escape through the window might be madness, but madness was the foundation of the impossible. The commander laughed suddenly, a low rasping sound that cut through the alarms. "You won't make it out," he spat, blood still trickling from the shallow cut at his throat. "You've come farther than anyone, but this is where it ends. You'll die here, just another ghost swallowed by the storm." His words were meant to rattle her, to plant the seed of doubt, but they only sharpened her resolve. She had not sacrificed everything to falter now. Her grip on him tightened as she shoved him toward the window, his body colliding with the glass, the impact rattling the frame. "Maybe," she whispered coldly, "but not before you." His eyes widened, the first flicker of true fear breaking through his bravado, and for the first time he seemed to understand that her presence here was not just skill, not just defiance, it was destiny. Below, guards swarmed into the courtyard, their rifles angled upward as they shouted orders into the storm. The compound was alive with panic now, the illusion of invulnerability shattered by the sight of their commander held captive. She forced him against the window again, the crack of glass splintering under the pressure. The storm's roar filled the room, lightning flashing so close it felt as though the sky itself was tearing apart. Her body ached with exhaustion, her muscles screaming from the fight, but her spirit burned brighter than ever. Every moment, every sacrifice, every warning she had ignored had led to this. She pressed her lips close to his ear, her words a final promise. "They told me it was impossible. They told me I would fail. But here you are, and here I stand." His body trembled in her grasp, his arrogance drained by the weight of inevitability. The storm was her ally now, its fury masking the sound of her resolve. The door behind her rattled violently as guards pounded against it, their shouts muffled by the thick steel. She had seconds, maybe less, before they broke through. With a final surge of strength, she yanked him backward and then hurled him forward with every ounce of power she had left. His body crashed into the window, glass exploding outward in a spray of shards, the storm rushing into the room with a deafening howl. For a moment time slowed. His scream was swallowed by the thunder as his body plummeted into the courtyard below, the silence that followed sharper than any explosion. The guards froze, their rifles lowering in disbelief as the figure who had commanded them, who had ruled through fear and cruelty, fell broken into the storm's embrace. She stood at the shattered frame, rain lashing against her face, her chest heaving as she stared down at the impossible made real. The target was gone. Silence followed his fall, heavy and absolute. The door burst open behind her, guards flooding into the room, their rifles raised, their eyes blazing with fury. She turned slowly, her knife still slick with blood, her figure silhouetted against the fractured glass and the raging storm beyond. They saw her now not as a lone intruder but as a force that had undone the impossible, and for the briefest of moments, none of them moved. The silence was louder than their weapons, heavier than their rage. She had done what no one else dared, what everyone said could not be done. And now, surrounded and outnumbered, she smiled faintly, not in triumph but in quiet defiance. Whatever happened next, she had already won. The storm raged through the shattered window, rain pelting the floor and wind tearing through the control room as the guards closed in. Their rifles glinted in the red pulse of the alarms, barrels steady, fingers poised to erase her in a storm of bullets. She raised her knife, though she knew it would do little against the wall of steel aimed at her chest. Still, she stood tall, her breath steady, her body refusing to cower. The target was gone, broken on the courtyard below, and in his absence the room felt hollow, stripped of the power he had embodied. For one brief heartbeat, no one moved. The silence stretched long, filled only by the storm's roar and the pounding of her heart. She could see their confusion, their hesitation. What were they without the man she had just torn from them? They had been told he was invincible. Now his body lay crumpled in the rain, proof that even gods could fall. That silence became her weapon, as sharp as any blade. Then one shouted, breaking the spell. "Take her." The command snapped them from their paralysis, rifles rising in unison, the promise of death in their eyes. She spun toward the shattered window, the wind tugging at her clothes as the courtyard loomed far below. The fall was madness, but madness was the only chance she had left. She leapt. Glass crunched beneath her boots as she dove into the storm, her body slicing through the rain, the world around her a blur of flashing lightning and screaming wind. For a second, weightlessness claimed her, the city spinning beneath her as if she were nothing more than a shadow cast into the void. Then her grappling line snapped taut, jerking her body hard as it caught on the anchor she had secured hours earlier. Pain shot through her shoulder as the harness dug into her, but she gritted her teeth and held on, swinging violently toward the outer wall of the compound. Bullets tore through the rain, guards leaning out the broken window, their shots chasing her descent. Sparks erupted as rounds struck steel, but she kept moving, her boots slamming against the wall as she scaled down with rapid precision. She hit the ground hard, rolling into a crouch as the compound erupted in chaos above her. Shouts echoed through the storm, searchlights cut across the courtyard, and alarms wailed louder, drowning the thunder. She tore the grappling hook free, her hands burning as she sprinted toward the outer fences. The storm shielded her again, rain lashing into the guards' eyes, thunder masking her footsteps. But they were hunting now, their anger sharp and unrelenting. She ducked behind crates, her breaths ragged, her knife still slick in her hand as she peered through the sheets of rain. The commander's body lay twisted in the courtyard, ignored by his men as they scrambled to avenge him. She felt no pity, no regret. His silence was the justice she had carried across the storm. But her mission was not survival alone, she had to escape with proof. The device tucked inside her vest, stolen in the chaos, contained every detail of his crimes. Without it, his death was only blood in the rain. With it, he would remain silent forever, his empire dismantled piece by piece. Searchlights swept dangerously close as she darted from cover to cover, her body aching with exhaustion but driven by raw determination. She reached the fence, its coils of barbed wire glistening under the floodlights. Beyond it lay the darkness of the city, the freedom of anonymity. But climbing it would expose her, a silhouette against the storm, an easy mark for every rifle trained her way. She crouched, scanning quickly, her mind racing for options. Then she saw it, a drainage tunnel beneath the eastern wall, its grate half buried in mud, overlooked in the chaos. She sprinted low, bullets snapping past her ears as shouts rang out behind. The mud clung to her boots as she dropped to her knees, her knife sawing through the rusted bars until the metal snapped. Water surged against her legs as she shoved herself inside, the cold current dragging at her body. Darkness swallowed her, the roar of the storm replaced by the echo of rushing water and the distant shouts of men too afraid to follow into the tunnel. The narrow passage pressed tight against her shoulders, water rising to her chest as she forced herself forward, each movement slow and suffocating. The air stank of rust and sewage, but she pushed on, her hands scraping against wet stone, her breath shallow in the choking space. Behind her, faint light flickered where the storm bled into the tunnel, but it grew dimmer with each crawl until nothing remained but blackness. She pressed on, her heartbeat echoing loud in the cramped silence, her body trembling with fatigue. Every inch forward was a victory, every breath a battle against despair. The current pulled at her, threatening to drag her under, but she braced herself against the walls, refusing to yield. The memory of the commander's lifeless fall burned in her mind, fueling her will. She had done what they said was impossible. She would not fall now, not when the truth still needed to be carried out of this storm. At last, the tunnel widened, the air fresher, the faint glimmer of light beckoning ahead. She crawled faster, her body scraping through mud and water until she spilled out onto the banks of a drainage ditch beyond the compound. The storm still raged overhead, lightning tearing through the clouds, but here the searchlights could not reach her. She collapsed into the mud, her chest heaving, her body racked with exhaustion. Rain washed the blood from her hands, mingling it with the dirt until it disappeared into the earth. For the first time she allowed herself a moment to breathe, to feel the weight of what she had done. The impossible was no longer a word, it was a memory shattered in silence. She closed her eyes briefly, letting the rain cool her fevered skin, before forcing herself to rise. She could not stop. Not yet. The city stretched before her, its lights muted by the storm, its streets alive with the hum of distant traffic. She pulled the hood of her cloak over her helmet, blending into the shadows as she limped toward safety. Her body ached, every muscle screaming, but the device pressed against her chest reminded her why she had to keep moving. The evidence inside it would expose everything. The networks, the operations, the crimes hidden beneath the man's empire. Without him and without his secrets, the walls his men had built would crumble. She imagined the faces of the doubters, the ones who had told her she was chasing a dream, who had called her reckless, arrogant, foolish. She imagined their silence when they saw what she carried, when they heard what she had done. That silence would echo louder than the commander's fall. That silence would be her victory. But even now danger lingered. His men would not stop at his death. They would hunt her across the city, desperate to reclaim the secrets she carried. She could already feel the chase tightening, the storm no longer her only adversary. Every shadow could hold a pursuer, every street a trap. She would have to vanish, to melt into the night until the world could hear the truth she carried. It tightened her grip on the knife, her eyes narrowing as she disappeared into the maze of rain-slick streets. The impossible had been done. Now came the harder part, surviving it. The streets glistened with rain, every surface alive with fractured reflections of neon and lightning, the storm above refusing to release its hold. She pulled her cloak tighter and moved quickly, her boots splashing through shallow puddles as the shadows became her only allies. The city never slept, not even in weather like this, but tonight its usual noise felt muffled, subdued, as if the storm itself had swallowed the life from the avenues. She blended with the few pedestrians braving the downpour, her head bowed, the device pressed firmly to her chest beneath the layers of soaked fabric. Each step forward felt heavier than the last, her body battered and drained, but she could not stop. She knew the commander's men were spreading through the streets even now, their orders clear: recover the stolen evidence, kill the thief who dared to challenge their empire. Her knife was still clutched tight in her hand beneath the cloak, its weight both a comfort and a reminder that survival was never guaranteed. She kept to the alleys, slipping between buildings where the glow of the billboards couldn't reach, and let the storm's veil hide her movements. Her mind replayed the moment of his fall again and again, the silence that followed when his body struck the ground. That silence had spread through his men like wildfire, breaking the illusion of invincibility, shattering years of fear in an instant. But silence was fragile, easily replaced by rage, and rage was what fueled their hunt now. She could feel it behind her, a heat that pushed her forward even as her body begged for rest. The storm roared, thunder cracking like cannon fire above, but beneath it she thought she heard the growl of engines, armored vehicles pushing into the streets in pursuit. She turned sharply into a narrow passage, her breath shallow, her pulse hammering in her ears. The alleys twisted into a labyrinth, the walls slick with water and grime, the smell of rust and smoke heavy in the air. She moved faster, knowing every second she lingered was a second closer to being cornered. Her mission was not yet done. Death alone would not dismantle the empire, truth would. Without the device, she had nothing but blood to show for her struggle. She could not let it end here. She reached a marketplace, the tarps of the stalls sagging under the storm, vendors shouting over the rain as they struggled to protect their wares. The chaos of human life pressed around her, and she allowed herself to melt into it, just another hooded figure pushing through the crowd. But her instincts kept her eyes sharp, scanning faces, movements, the subtle tension of men trying to look like they belonged. She spotted them, 3 of his guards moving deliberately against the tide of the market, eyes searching, hands brushing beneath coats where weapons waited. Her stomach clenched, but she kept moving, resisting the urge to run. Running here would be suicide. Instead, she slipped into a stall heavy with smoke from roasting meat, the vendor shouting angrily as she shoved past. The smoke cloaked her long enough for her to duck into another alley, her heart racing as shouts erupted behind her. They had seen her. The chase was alive again. She ran, the knife clutched in her hand, her boots slipping on the slick cobblestones as the storm poured down harder. The alley narrowed, then opened into a canal, its black waters churning angrily beneath a broken bridge. For a moment she hesitated, her chest burning, the evidence weighing heavy against her ribs. Behind her, footsteps pounded, shouts echoing closer. She took the only choice left. With a sharp breath, she leapt into the canal. The water was freezing, dragging her down instantly, filling her lungs with its foul taste. She kicked furiously, forcing herself upward until her head broke the surface, gasping as the storm pounded down upon her. The current swept her along, carrying her beneath low arches and through tunnels where the city's lights faded into black. She clung to the device beneath her cloak, her fingers numb but unyielding. She would rather drown than let it fall into their hands. Time lost all meaning in the dark rush of the canal, but finally the current spit her out onto a bank lined with weeds and broken stone. She crawled from the water, coughing violently, her body shaking with cold and exhaustion. She collapsed to her knees, gasping as the storm continued to lash her, but she refused to let her grip loosen. The device was still there, unbroken, a small flicker of light blinking faintly through its casing. Relief surged through her, but it was short-lived. She could still hear them in the distance, their shouts carrying over the storm, relentless. They were not giving up, not now, not ever. She forced herself upright, her body screaming in protest, and stumbled onward into the dark outskirts of the city. The buildings here were older, abandoned, their windows shattered, their walls scarred by time and neglect. She slipped into one, her footsteps echoing faintly in the hollow shell. The silence pressed heavy, broken only by the drip of rainwater through holes in the ceiling. She leaned against a crumbling wall, pulling the device free from her vest. Her hands trembled as she held it, its blinking light casting faint glimmers on her weary face. This was her victory, her proof, her weapon. But even as she stared at it, doubt crept into her mind. Would anyone believe it? Would anyone dare to stand against an empire built on fear, even with evidence laid bare? She shook the thought away, clutching it tighter. Belief didn't matter. What mattered was the truth. The truth had to be carried, spoken, released, no matter the cost. She had given blood for it, she had watched a man fall silent for it, and she would not falter now. A sound broke the stillness, the creak of a door, the shuffle of boots. Her knife was in her hand instantly, her muscles coiled though her strength was fading. Shadows moved in the far corner, dark shapes slipping silently into the building. She froze, her breath sharp, every nerve screaming. They had found her. She moved backward slowly, her eyes locked on the figures, the device pressed to her chest with her free hand. The storm outside rumbled, lightning flashing through the broken windows, and for a heartbeat the shadows became faces, men in black, rifles raised, their eyes cold with purpose. She knew she couldn't fight them all. She couldn't outrun them this time. But she could protect what mattered. With a surge of desperate resolve, she turned and bolted toward the stairwell, their shouts exploding behind her as bullets tore into the walls. She flew upward, 2 steps at a time, the old structure groaning beneath the weight of pursuit. At the top, she burst into a room with half its roof collapsed, the storm pouring through the broken beams. Wind and rain whipped around her as she skidded to a halt, cornered on the crumbling edge. Behind her, the men poured into the room, their rifles aimed, their orders barked. She stood there, knife raised, device pressed to her chest, her cloak torn and dripping, her eyes burning with defiance. They thought they had her. They thought the chase was over. But she still had the storm. She still had silence. She still had the impossible. With a deep breath, she stepped backward, letting the wind claim her once more as she vanished into the rain, the night swallowing her whole. The storm swallowed her fall, the night clutching her in its cold embrace as she plunged once again into the chaos below. The world spun, wind howling in her ears, rain blinding her eyes, and for an instant she felt weightless, as though she had surrendered to the abyss itself. But survival was carved into her bones, and instinct twisted her body midair until her boots struck the slanted roof of a neighboring structure. The impact rattled her ribs and stole her breath, but she slid with control, rolling hard before tumbling into the gutter. Her knife clattered against the tiles, almost lost, but her hand snapped out, catching it in desperation before it could vanish. She lay still for a heartbeat, gasping, the device pressed tightly against her chest as if it were the last piece of her soul. Then shouts pierced the storm above, the men leaning from the broken building, their rifles seeking her through the darkness. She dragged herself up, her muscles screaming, and forced her body to keep moving. The storm had not abandoned her yet. She had to trust it would cover her path one more time. She leapt from rooftop to rooftop, her legs trembling, her cloak heavy with rain. Each gap felt wider than the last, her body nearly giving way, but desperation lent her strength. The city spread beneath her like a sea of shadows, the lights blurred by the storm, the streets crawling with armored vehicles and patrols. She knew the noose was tightening, that her window was closing, and that survival hinged on one final act. The evidence she carried could not simply remain in her hands, it had to be unleashed. Somewhere in this city was a point of release, a way to make sure the truth could not be buried even if she were. Her mind raced as she ran, sifting through memory, through scraps of intelligence, until it landed on the one place she had always known would be her endgame: the tower. The old broadcast tower at the heart of the city, long abandoned, its screens dark but its systems still intact beneath the rust. It had been a relic, forgotten by most, but she knew its bones still breathed power. If she could reach it, if she could plug the device into its veins, the city itself would carry the truth to every corner of the world. Her lungs burned as she dropped from the roofs into an alley, landing hard and rolling into shadow. A patrol's headlights swept across the street beyond, their voices sharp and restless. She held her breath, her body pressed against wet brick, the knife still firm in her grip. The storm masked her, thunder rolling just as boots passed close enough she could have reached out and cut them down. But she waited, patient, letting them move on before she slipped into the open street. The tower loomed in the distance now, its skeleton rising like a jagged scar against the stormlit sky. Every step toward it was agony, every movement a battle against exhaustion, but she refused to stop. The silence of the commander's fall echoed in her ears, urging her onward, reminding her of the promise she had made with that act. The impossible had been done. Now the impossible had to mean something. The streets grew emptier as she neared the tower, fewer guards here but heavier vehicles, their engines rumbling like predators waiting in the dark. She crept through ruins and rubble, the storm washing away her tracks, until she reached the base of the tower itself. Rust streaked the steel supports, vines crawling up the lower levels, but the structure still pulsed faintly with forgotten power. Lightning flashed above, casting its silhouette in a stark brilliance that seemed to pierce the storm itself. She placed her hand against the cold metal, her fingers trembling as if she could feel the heartbeat of what lay inside. For a moment she allowed herself to close her eyes, to imagine what would come if she succeeded. Screens across the city flaring to life, voices silenced for years finally heard, the lies of an empire crumbling in the face of truth. And then she opened them again, hard and focused, and began to climb. The tower groaned beneath her weight, the storm clawing at her with every step. Wind whipped her cloak violently, rain stung her eyes, and lightning crackled dangerously close. But her hands held firm, her knife clamped between her teeth as she pulled herself higher, one rung at a time, her body shaking with fatigue yet unwilling to yield. Below, shouts rose as the patrols spotted her, their lights converging on the tower, their rifles barking fire into the storm. Bullets pinged off the steel supports, sparks exploding around her, but she kept climbing, each pull of her arms a declaration that she would not stop until the truth was free. The higher she climbed, the stronger the storm became, the wind threatening to rip her from the tower and dash her against the ground. But her grip was iron, her will unbreakable, her heart beating only one word: forward. At last she reached the platform halfway up, a metal nest overlooking the city. The control unit was there, rusted and weather-beaten, its screens dark, its buttons corroded, but the core system still intact. She landed heavily on the platform, her knees buckling, her breaths ragged. The patrols below shouted louder, their voices lost in the thunder as more men poured into the square, their floodlights piercing the rain. She ignored them, pulling the device from her chest and slamming it into the ancient port. For a terrible second nothing happened. The storm raged, the screens remained dead, and despair threatened to claw at her heart. But then, with a flicker, a spark of light pulsed across the rusted screen. The system coughed to life, old circuits humming, long-dormant power lines awakening. The device's light merged with the tower's, data streaming, truth pouring into veins that had waited years to be filled. She staggered, clutching the console, tears mixing with rain as she realized it was working. The silence she had carved in blood was about to be broken by truth. Then the first bullet struck her shoulder. She cried out, the force spinning her to the ground, blood spilling instantly through her cloak. Another round pinged off the platform beside her, sparks showering her body as she dragged herself upright. The guards had climbed onto lower levels, their rifles fixed, their fury unrelenting. Pain flared hot, but she refused to fall. She pressed her hand to the wound, her other still clutching the knife as she stood before the console, a sentinel of defiance. The screens began to glow brighter, static turning into images, voices whispering into life. The commander's crimes, his networks, his betrayals, all unfolding across the city, carried by every hidden channel the tower could still reach. She smiled through the pain, her body trembling as the truth began to flood into the world. Below, chaos erupted. Citizens stopped in the streets, eyes lifted as forgotten screens lit up, projecting the hidden darkness of the empire. Voices long silenced were suddenly loud, undeniable, echoing through every home, every alley, every heart. Fear turned to shock, shock to anger, anger to hope. The empire had ruled with silence, but now silence had been broken. She could hear the cries rising even through the storm, even through the blood pounding in her ears. The guards below shouted frantically, their bullets tearing into the tower, but she no longer cared. Her mission was complete. The truth was free. The silence she had carried across the storm had become a roar. Another bullet struck her side, pain ripping through her body, but she did not fall. She gripped the console, her eyes fixed on the screens glowing brighter with each passing second. The storm raged around her, lightning splitting the sky as though the heavens themselves were bearing witness. Her body was broken, but her spirit stood unyielding. They had told her it was impossible. They had laughed, doubted, scorned. And yet here she was, standing on a tower of rust and storm, bleeding but victorious, as the impossible unfolded before the world's eyes. The silence of the commander's fall had become the voice of a people rising, and she knew in her last breath that it had all been worth it. The storm's fury blended with the chaos below as the tower shuddered beneath a hail of bullets, metal groaning, sparks leaping across the platform. Her body trembled, blood soaking through her cloak, her wounds burning with every heartbeat, yet she clung to the console as if it were the very heart of her existence. The screens above her burned brighter, flickering across the skyline, casting the truth into every corner of the city. Images of torture, recordings of corruption, ledgers of stolen wealth and murdered innocents. Each revelation louder than the next, each secret tearing another stone from the Empire's walls. She could almost hear it breaking, the Empire's silence cracking open into screams, shouts, gasps of awakening. Her chest rose and fell in ragged bursts, her vision blurred by pain and rain, but her eyes never left the screens. She had done it. The silence she had carved with her blade had become the storm of truth. The impossible was alive, echoing across the world. The guards below were frantic, their leader barking orders as they scrambled up the tower. Their rifles spat fire, bullets slicing into the steel, ricocheting dangerously close, but she no longer flinched. She stood there, defiant, knife in hand, blood on her lips, and raised her voice for the first time that night. It was not a scream, not a battle cry, but a whisper carried by the storm, words that seemed to fold into the thunder itself. You cannot stop it now. Her voice was weak, cracked by exhaustion, but it carried weight, and even those hunting her faltered as the screens above them glared brighter, louder, undeniable. The truth was no longer hers to guard. It had escaped into the veins of the city, into the hearts of the people. She was only the vessel, and even if she broke, the message would remain whole. She staggered, dropping to one knee as her strength bled away. Her knife clattered to the floor, her fingers too weak to hold it, but she did not reach for it again. Instead, she pressed her hand against the console, smearing it with her blood, as if sealing her promise into the machine itself. Pain roared through her body, her breath shallow, her limbs heavy, but her heart burned with a strange, fierce peace. She remembered the voices that had told her this was madness, that she would fail, that she would never touch the untouchable. Impossible, they had called her dream. She thought of them now, imagined their faces lit by the glow of the truth spilling into their homes, imagined the silence that must have filled their mouths as reality crushed doubt. That silence, more than the commander's fall, was her victory. She smiled faintly, her lips trembling as thunder rolled across the heavens. The first guard reached the platform, his rifle raised, his boots clanging against the steel. She did not move. Her eyes lifted, meeting his through the storm, and for a heartbeat he froze. Perhaps it was the sight of her, broken yet unbowed, her body drenched in blood but her eyes still burning. Perhaps it was the knowledge that no bullet could undo what she had unleashed. Whatever it was, hesitation flickered in him, enough for her to see it before his commander shouted from below. The hesitation vanished. The rifle barked, the bullet struck, and her body jolted violently before collapsing against the console. Pain exploded, then dulled, her limbs refusing to obey, her vision dimming. She felt the warmth of her life spilling onto the steel, mingling with the rain, but still she clung to the console, refusing to fall away from it. The tower was hers even in death. Her sight blurred further, colors bleeding together, the storm a haze of light and shadow. But through it she saw the screens blaze with one final surge, the device pouring every last fragment of truth into the veins of the city. Her name was nowhere in it, her face never shone, but her act was there, woven into the silence of the commander's fall, etched into the roar of the storm. She had never wanted glory, only justice, only to prove that silence could be broken. And now, as her strength ebbed, she felt it in the wind itself. The shift, the awakening, the impossible turned real. The voices of the people rose, faint at first, then swelling, a tide of sound that reached her even on the tower. Shouts, chants, cries for freedom, for change, for vengeance against the empire that had fed them lies. Her heart stuttered, but it swelled with pride. She had given them their voice back. That was enough. The guards swarmed the platform, surrounding her broken form, their rifles aimed, their faces twisted with fury. But when they reached for the console, for the device, they found only dead channels, the data already gone, scattered through the networks like seeds on the wind. They cursed, shouting, slamming fists against the screens, but she only smiled weakly, blood dripping from her lips. It was too late. They could kill her, but they could not kill what she had done. Her silence would not be theirs to control. It belonged now to the people rising beyond the tower, their voices climbing higher, carried by the storm. The guards realized it too, their rage curdling into fear, their eyes darting to the city below as if they could already feel the ground shifting under their empire. She saw it in them, the same hesitation, the same cracks that had spread when the commander fell. They had believed themselves untouchable. Now they knew better. Her body grew colder, her breath shallow, her grip on the console slipping. She let herself sink down, her cheek resting against the steel, her eyes half-lidded but still fixed on the storm outside. Lightning split the sky, thunder roared, and for a moment it seemed the heavens themselves were answering her. She thought of those who had walked with her, those who had fallen, those who had doubted, those who had believed. She thought of the faces she would never see again, of the lives still trapped beneath the Empire's shadow, and hoped that her act would be enough to break their chains. She thought of silence, how heavy it had been, how cruel, how final, and how sweet it felt now, not as a prison but as a weapon. The silence she had carried, the silence they had mocked, had become the silence of a tyrant falling, the silence of doubt breaking, the silence of fear shattering. It was not emptiness. It was victory. Her vision narrowed, her world fading to the storm's rhythm, but she did not fear it. Death had stalked her every step of this path, and now that it finally reached her, she greeted it not with sorrow but with peace. The impossible had been done. The truth was free. Her part in the story was over, but the echoes of her act would live in every voice rising against the Empire, in every screen that had carried her defiance, in every silence that had been broken. She let out one last breath, soft, steady, carried away by the wind as her eyes closed. The storm raged on, the city roared, and the tower stood tall, its screens blazing against the night. Below, the people gathered, their voices a tide that swallowed the square, their chants drowning the shouts of the guards. The Empire's soldiers faltered, their weapons heavy, their certainty gone. The truth had stripped them bare, and the silence of their commander's fall had grown into a roar they could not control. Change had come, carried by the storm, and it would not be stopped. And though her body lay still upon the tower, though her voice would never speak again, the story of what she had done spread like fire, whispered in alleys, shouted in squares, carried in hearts. They would remember her not by her name, but by her act, by the impossible she had made real. They would remember the night the target dropped in silence, and the world woke from its fear. The end.